You can run, but you can't hide!
Hey there guys, this is your host Richard with another marvelous video. If your liking for the Mad Max franchise is solely dependent on the most recent two films, well, you're sorely missing out. The original trilogy pretty much redefined the idea of a chase scene. Not just that, George Miller's Mad Max saga has inspired a plethora of post-apocalyptic films, burner culture, and of course, fashion. Through Mel Gibson's Mad Max, Miller introduced the mainstream world to a very specific style of films and well, let's be real, without it, I doubt we'd even have movies like Lethal Weapon or really any other 80s movies for that matter. Worst of all, had it not been for Miller's crazy vehicles and his portrayal of Darwinism through humans who fighting to control their bare necessities, we wouldn't even have Rick and Morty. This sprawl of spectacular action sequences that have been shown to make an impact for over 4 decades wasn't easy to create. So in today's video, we'll discuss some not-so-common facts about the Mad Max franchise known to the general guy. Without wasting another moment, let's get right to it. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. Yeah, this is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The original Mad Max movie was banned in New Zealand. So, the original Mad Max that was released in 1979 was actually banned in New Zealand because of how one key scene was disturbingly similar to a certain real-life incident. It's no news that this franchise has seen some major tonal shifts over its 5 movies. The first Mad Max was a dark and gritty revenge thriller that was stark and brutal, but its 1981 sequel, The Road Warrior, chose a more goofy and exaggerated post-apocalyptic adventure route. By the third movie, the tone lightened even more, becoming rather silly. But Miller did it again with Fury Road in 2015, amping up the violence and propulsiveness while still maintaining a sense of unreality. As time passed, the films never went back to the raw feel of grounded realism like the original 1979 film, which was inspired as much from gory westerns like those of Sam Peckinpah as it did from the science fiction genre. Plus, the original movie was set in the future, mainly to cut down on location costs, which perhaps explains why the first film feels much harsher and grounded as compared to its more whimsical sequels. Despite its darker tone, the original Mad Max didn't struggle much at the box office. Released in 1979, this futuristic thriller was a huge hit worldwide, earning millions and propelling its lead actor to an A-list status in Hollywood. However, the good people of New Zealand were made to wait in order to see what all the excitement was about. On August 9, 1979, New Zealand's chief censor banned the film due to its violence and antisocial behavior. But it's believed that a certain incident in New Zealand involving gang members trying to set a police sergeant named Charles O'Hara on fire was what led to this ban. According to police reports, criminals in New Zealand attempted to burn the officer in his car in a way that had an uncanny resemblance to Jim Goose's death in Mad Max. Although this scene wasn't officially cited in the records that would lead to the film's temporary ban, it was quite evident that real-life events influenced the decision. When the Film Censorship Board of Review re-examined the film, they noted that Mad Max could cause gang troubles, which would be injurious to the public good. Interestingly, The Road Warrior originally had a crazy twisted ending where Goose had survived, although this didn't make it into the final cut. However, the massive success of The Road Warrior forced the Film Censorship Board of Review to lift the ban on the original Mad Max in 1983. Even though the 1979 movie received a very restrictive R18 rating, it was officially unbanned, which likely led to the fewer restrictions for the other movies in the series. Apparently, George Miller had traveled to New Zealand in order to argue against the ban during the censorship review process, but even then his efforts were in vain. This meant that New Zealand movie fans couldn't see the original hit until after its first sequel was released, making the timeline of the Mad Max movies even more confusing. Lucky for them, none of the later, more goofed-up Mad Max sequels faced the same issue with the Film Censorship Board of Review in New Zealand when they hit cinema screens years later. Bar brawl or brilliant casting? Mystery of Mel Gibson's casting. For decades, Mel Gibson was best known for his role as Max Rokitansky. The tough guy Australian actor seemed perfect for the part, but it's important to remember that Gibson wasn't a known actor when the original Mad Max was made in 1979. So, George Miller and Byron Kennedy initially offered the role of Max Rokitansky to Irish-born actor James Healy, but he turned it down because Miller was making the film on a shoestring budget and couldn't afford to hire professionals. He was getting frustrated because they still couldn't find their Max, until a casting agent asked him to check out some graduates from the National Institute of Dramatic Art, a prestigious Australian art school that only accepts fewer than 30 students per year. Among the 1977 alumni was Steve Bisley, who was then Mel Gibson's housemate. Apparently, Mel gave Steve a ride to the audition for Mad Max, and the night before, Mel had been in a bar brawl with a group of rugby players and got pretty roughed up. That whole thing didn't end up too well for him, though. Mel's whole face was covered in different shades of rainbow from the bruises and cuts. Now, when the casting director saw him, they mentioned they were actually looking for freaks for the cast. Apparently, the women in the casting office even took some pictures of him and asked him to come back when he'd healed up a bit so they could see what he really looked like. In the meantime, Steve was cast as Max's best friend and partner, Jim Goose. Gibson said he didn't look very pretty then, but that roughneck brawler look was exactly what they were searching for. When he returned, Gibson's face was now more healed, and they were surprised to see that he was quite a handsome guy once all the swelling and bruising went away. By this time, George was even more exhausted from his search for Max. But when Mel Gibson walked in, George felt a chill go up his spine, and as he looked through the eyepiece of his camera, he knew he'd found his Max. Eventually, Mel Gibson got the part after being asked to memorize a couple of pages of dialogue. It's ironic because Max became known as a man of few words, but if you watch that first movie, you'll notice that he has a lot more to say compared to his post-apocalyptic version in the later films. So, if Gibson hadn't gotten into a fight with half a rugby team and lost, we might never have gotten the Mad Max as we know him today. Maybe this is what they mean by the butterfly effect. The story was based on the real-life event. Many of you don't know that before Miller became a cultural icon, he was a doctor. Even if he was always interested in cinema, Miller pursued a career as a doctor after graduating med school. He actually got the idea for the original Mad Max while working as a junior doctor. Miller apparently witnessed a tragic event where a policeman had to attend his own son's funeral after he passed away in a fatal accident, and it was this experience which inspired him to create his multi-million-dollar franchise. As you already know, Mad Max follows the story of Max, a police officer in a futuristic Australia who first loses his best friend, then his wife and child, who were all murdered by a vicious biker gang. But unlike the real-life incident, in the film, Max exacts his revenge before becoming a drifting loner in the Australian wasteland. This tragic incident that inspired George Miller deeply influenced his approach to filmmaking, motivating him to create a movie that communicated primarily through visuals, relying on the power of imagery. Miller aimed to craft something grand, which is why he chose to set the franchise in an apocalyptic world. Interestingly, the real-life tragedy that sparked his inspiration occurred in the real world, but he translated that experience into a more fictional, post-apocalyptic setting for the Mad Max series. George Miller shared that the initial concept for the film didn't involve a dystopian setting. Instead, it was the difficulty of filming action scenes in modern-day Melbourne that led him to explore an allegorical dystopian world. Given his initially tight budget, Miller found it almost impossible to capture the emptiness he wanted on the city streets, which sparked the idea to create a future where such desolation would be believable for his film. The Mad Max franchise is actually based on a real-life apocalypse. So, according to a report, all of the Mad Max franchise was inspired by the 1970s energy crisis. Given that the first Mad Max film was set in a barren wasteland within Australia, Miller wanted to show how the continent was affected by the crisis. Apparently, there was an acute shortage of fuel in Australia from 1971, after an embargo that took effect in 1973. It said that the Arab petroleum exporting countries put an embargo in place as a response to the US when the country continued supplying weapons to Israel during the Yom Kippur War. As a result, the entire world suffered from a shortage of oil to a point that people were literally being given gas rations. While some gas stations served their regular customers on the basis of appointments, others were mostly closed. People went to crazy heights in order to conserve electricity, energy, and power that ultimately threw the world in a constant panic mode. Australia introduced a martial law to control the situation, and later the economy collapsed in 1972, inducing a massive layoff across all industries. As people flocked to the bank to withdraw their entire life savings, riots were spreading across Melbourne and Sydney. During this chaos, many biker gangs took over territories as cars were simply abandoned on the streets for the lack of gas. If you remember much of the Mad Max franchise's early plots, you'll notice many similarities with these events. So, given how most of Fury Road was rooted to a civilization being rocked by environmental and political crises, alongside the original Mad Max film being set in a world plummeting from the societal collapse fueled by oil shortages, the energy crisis of Australia is said to be the real inspiration behind it. From director to doctor, how Miller doctored up Mad Max funding. Like I've mentioned before, the original Mad Max film was made on a shoestring budget. It took 12 weeks to film on the outskirts of Melbourne, which was chosen for its post-apocalyptic vibe, and George Miller literally managed to produce the entire film for just $350,000. Even that relatively small amount was quite a challenge to raise, especially compared to the massive budgets that many movies today have, which can run into tens or even hundreds of millions. George Miller and Byron Kennedy went on to pitch the film to multiple studios, and initially, they also tried to secure a government grant. But the Australian government was more interested in funding art house films rather than post-apocalyptic blockbusters. This made it difficult for Kennedy and Miller to find the funding they needed for their action horror movie. Even after securing partial funding for the film, Kennedy and Miller still had to contribute some of their own money to cover the budget and to raise more funds, so they came up with creative solutions. For instance, Miller, who was also a trained doctor, worked as an emergency medical responder while Kennedy drove him to accident scenes, allowing them to earn additional money for the film. I think when they say that Mad Max is a passion-fueled franchise, this is exactly what they mean. Real bikers, real threat. 1979 Mad Max's villains were no act, so Miller and his team took several daring risks to bring the low-budget Mad Max film to life. While these bold decisions added the gritty realism of the apocalyptic film, Miller made one notable choice when he hired real motorcycle gangs to work on the movie. In Mad Max, the head of the biker gang, Toe Cutter, was played by Australian actor Hugh Keays-Byrne. Interestingly enough, the rest of Toe Cutter's gang consisted of real-life bikers from the Vigilantes, a motorcycle gang who joined the production after Miller posted an ad in a bike shop window. Additionally, two other motorcycle gangs, the Barbarians and the Victorian Four Owners Club, were also recruited for various biker roles in the film. While the production did hire some professional stunt people, many of the motorcycle stunts were actually performed by the Vigilantes using their own bikes. According to Tim Burns, the bikers from the Vigilantes were eager to ride fast and perform stunts whenever they could. So, many scenes in the movie, including precision riding and high-speed driving, were done by the Vigilantes themselves. The film's cinematographer, David Egby, even strapped himself and his heavy camera to the back of the president of the biker gang in order to shoot a scene where Goose races down the road at dangerous speeds. During this intense sequence, the biker pushed his bike to extreme speeds, reaching almost 110 miles per hour, while Egby barely held on without a helmet. If Mad Max had been able to afford professional actors and stunt doubles for the biker gangs, it might have achieved a higher level of technical skill. However, by doing so, it would have lost some of the wild energy that makes the setting really feel like a lawless wasteland. Having real bikers invoked a sense of authenticity to the film. Even Hugh Keays-Byrne, the guy who played Toe Cutter, spent 3 days riding 550 miles in full costume with the Vigilantes to get into character. This experience gave him insights into details like carrying camping gear and safely storing his character's axe on the bike. These details carried over into the movie, making the world of Mad Max feel really lived in and realistic, which ultimately helped bring its apocalyptic setting to life. Illegal stunts of Mad Max. In contrast to all the modern movies in the franchise, many of the stunts in the first Mad Max's action scenes were actually illegal. This meant they had to be done very quickly in order to avoid being caught by the Australian authorities during filming. George Miller described this entire shooting process as a form of guerrilla filmmaking, because of the whole shebang about the film's low budget and the lack of industry precedent at the time forced him to shoot most scenes illicitly. Because of how illegal some of these stunts were, Miller and Byron Kennedy literally had to clean up the roads themselves after all the car crash scenes were shot. Apparently, they'd stay back at night to sweep up and ensure that everything was in order to avoid getting into trouble. This can be seen clearly in the first scene shot of the production, where Johnny is on the phone on the overpass. When Johnny breaks the chain and quickly runs off, it's actually because the crew didn't have the permission to film on the overpass while regular traffic was passing by. Beer budget. All the Mad Max extras got paid in brews. The 1979 Mad Max was truly a film like no other, and because Australia had never experienced such an action-packed production before, the filming infrastructure and financial support weren't really as established. To overcome these challenges, the team had to be resourceful and find clever ways to save money. For instance, some extras were compensated with beer instead of cash for their work, which sometimes involved more than just standing around. Because of the tight budget, many extras had to bring their own cars and vehicles for certain scenes. In a particularly challenging situation, a random truck driver was offered just $50 and a case of beer to run over a motorcycle with his truck for the film's final scene. However, the driver was hesitant to damage his truck. As you know, it was the ultimate source for his bread and butter, and $50 was simply not worth the risk. To solve this, the production team attached a shield to the front of the truck to save it from any potential damages and painted it red to blend in, making it look like a natural part of his vehicle for the scene. Shoestring budget, Mad Max edited in Miller's living room. So, after Tony Patterson spent over 4 months editing Mad Max, he had to leave because of his signed contract to work on Dimboola, an independent film adaptation of a spicy marriage play. This left George Miller with the task of making up for all the lost time in post-production. However, due to the film's limited budget, the post-production process was also back-breaking and underfunded. At first, Miller brought in Cliff Hayes to help him out with editing. Hayes, who was both a producer and editor, later worked on projects like I Am Evangeline 2015 and even edited an episode of a TV series in 2001, which was based on The Beastmaster 1982. During the most challenging phase of post-production, George Miller and Byron Kennedy worked tirelessly on the final cut of the film. They spent almost 3 grueling months at Miller's own house, with Kennedy focusing on cutting sound in the lounge room while Miller tackled picture editing in the kitchen. Kennedy also came back to later work on the sequel, but tragically passed away prematurely from a tragic helicopter crash accident in 1983.
Why? Quite a big change of heart. Believe me.
Mad Max movies most fights stay off screen. After the first few weeks of its release, Mad Max received many mixed reviews from critics. This critic dude named Philip Adams strongly criticized the film for its high levels of violence. Adams went as far as to call it a favorite of the likes of sadists, rapists, child killers, and even the incipient Mansons. Bro even compared its emotional impact to Mein Kampf, which was certainly not a flattering comparison and, well, all in all, a far-fetched from a glowing review. Another critic of the New York Times by the name of Tom Buckley was also pretty harsh, describing the film as ugly, incoherent, and targeting uncritical moviegoers. However, these reviews simply don't reflect the version of the movie that us fans recognize or appreciate. Now, contrary to what some harsh critics say, Mad Max wasn't overly violent on screen. The most intense violence is actually implied and shown indirectly, with viewers seeing the aftermath rather than the acts themselves. So, George Miller defended the film with equal acumen, noting that there were only about 50 frames of explicit violence in the entire movie, which is much less than what's usually seen in other popular films from that era. Body doubles gone body parts when Max borrowed a knee. So in Mad Max 1979, particularly in the close-up scene where Max's knee was shot, it wasn't really Mel Gibson's knee, but it actually belonged to a special effects expert named Chris Murray. Similarly, in the scene where Max's arm was run over by a motorcycle, the arm shown was actually of the film's stunt coordinator, Grant Pages. This dude literally took precautions by cutting a hole in the asphalt to ensure he wasn't injured during the stunt. To think he could have actually lost an arm? Literal chills. Lucky pup, Max's dog almost got scrapped. So, do you guys remember Max Rokitansky's cute 4-legged companion in Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior? What you didn't know is that Max's dog was a rescue from a local pound, who was saved from being euthanized the very next day. Originally, the role was meant for a 3-legged dog, but the production team couldn't find one. On the dog's first day on set, he had an unfortunate mishap in Max's car due to being scared by loud noises. After that incident, he had to wear makeshift earplugs made from cotton balls to help calm his nerves during filming. Whatever it is, I hope Dog went on to live a long and happy life.
We all lost someone below, but we do it.
Mr. Sweden played a major role. Miller's masked villains have always been iconic, be it Immortan Joe or Lord Humongous. I really think people don't realize how difficult it is to come across a villain so beautifully deranged as Humongous. From the dude's brain chemistry to his bodily design, everything screamed perfection. I'd really love to see a prequel exploring Humongous and his backstory of how he became the batshit crazy leader of the Marauders. With that being said, what many of you do not know is that Kjell Nilsson, the guy who brought the character of Humongous to life on the screen, had previously been Mr. Sweden. Even though Miller never gave any solid origin story to Lord Humongous, the character was envisioned as a former military man who had endured serious burns, which is why he wore the hockey mask throughout the entire film. During production, the bald head prosthetic, complete with a throbbing vein, apparently broke, which is why you only see it throbbing once in the movie. But seriously, Coma Doof Warrior gets an origin story, but our boy Humongous doesn't? Now in what world is that fair? Heath Ledger was supposed to become Mad Max. As you know, Mad Max Fury Road was struggling in development for decades because George Miller had been consistently mulling over a feature-length chase scene for the fourth Mad Max film since 1987. However, the concept didn't fully come together until 1998, when he decided to make people the focus of the chase instead of the consequences of the lack of oil. But again, the plans to begin filming in 2001 were cancelled due to the events of 9/11 and the subsequent decline of the American dollar against the Australian dollar. If production had started as planned, Heath Ledger would have been able to play the character of Max in 2003. I mean, sure, there was a chance where he could still have played the role if filming had taken place before his untimely death in 2008, but seriously, what a missed opportunity. Heath Ledger playing a stoic Max Rokitansky would have truly been an honor to watch. A single scene of Fury Road takes 138 days. So, according to Charlize Theron's perspective, the entire movie is encapsulated in that one scene. In one of our previous videos on the Mad Max franchise, I'd mentioned how Fury Road was conceived through Miller's collection of 15 years worth of elaborate storyboards. This unique approach of using a storyboard instead of a traditional written script, especially for a film mainly focused on a continuous chase, meant that they spent more than 4 months filming just that one single chase scene. The goal was to maintain continuity throughout to ensure they could navigate through the story effectively. As Charlize Theron mentioned, movies usually have various scenes, but in this case, the entire film was essentially one continuous chase scene. They spent a total of 138 days shooting this continuous scene, which was pretty challenging because every day they arrived without even knowing exactly where they were supposed to be within that scene. The movie existed primarily in George Miller's mind, so the cast simply had to trust his vision and let him lead the way. Flamethrower guitar, more metal than muscle could hold. Right from the very beginning of filming Fury Road, George Miller insisted on using practical effects instead of relying heavily on CGI to enhance the movie's intensity. One standout example of this dedication was when they went an extra mile to create a real flamethrowing guitar for the Doof Warrior, who was played by the Australian musician Iota. This mind-blowing instrument weighed a whopping 132 pounds and had a whammy bar to control the flames, so basically the thrill of rock and roll must have felt as banger as it looked. The production designer of Fury Road, Colin Gibson, even mentioned how Miller preferred practical props that could actually function. Good thing they don't use bombs in the film. Just theories. Tom Hardy's Mad Max is the feral kid from Mad Max 2. So, if you may have noticed, the continuity in the Mad Max series can be a bit scattered. For instance, Hugh Keith-Byrne was cast as Toe Cutter in the first film and then again recast as Immortan Joe in Fury Road. But they're not the same character because Immortan Joe was a senior military officer before the apocalypse, unlike Toe Cutter, who was just a rash street thug. Similarly, Bruce Spence played Gyro Captain in Mad Max 2 and Jedediah in Beyond Thunderdome. Despite both the characters being pilots, they're not the same person as they don't recognize each other in either film. Sure, the Mad Max films are definitely connected by an overarching background and atmosphere, but they're not restricted within a certain continuity, so there isn't really one single correct interpretation of how everything fits together. But there has been one interesting theory that suggests that the Mad Max stories are like campfire tales passed down over time. In this view, there was a man named Max who performed heroic deeds in the past, but the details have become fuzzy and warped with each retelling. Based on that, many people have come up with their own theories that the feral kid from Mad Max 2 later grows up to be Tom Hardy's Max in Fury Road. But this theory has one glaring pothole. Max can't be the feral kid because in the first Mad Max movie already documents Max's early days as a young police officer, and later we see him as an adult during the early days of society collapsing into a post-apocalyptic world. So if you keep that in mind, it's impossible for Max to be the feral kid who practically grew up in the post-apocalyptic society and knew no other way of life. Just because there's a new actor playing Max doesn't mean it's a different character. In Mad Max 2, the feral kid's voiceover at the end also mentioned how he grew up to become the chief of the Great Northern Tribe, further indicating that he didn't become Max. Instead, the feral kid is shown to grow up to become the old man who narrates the story of Mad Max to a new generation, which means he's the storyteller, not Max himself. Even the opening credits of the Mad Max films explicitly state that Max Rokitansky is the character played by Tom Hardy, not the feral kid. Apart from that, in Hardy's opening voiceover narration, he mentions that he was once a cop, a detail that the feral kid's character never had.
Me or everyone else.
Mad Max, The Fury Road was almost a never-ending wasteland ride. So, during the filming of Fury Road, the project has started to go over budget. This prompted Jeff Robinov, the then president of Warner Brothers, to literally fly down to Namibia and deliver an ultimatum to George Miller and his team, asking them to stop shooting by December 8th, no matter what. But the major issue was that they hadn't even started filming the crucial bookend scenes at the Citadel. So, when production halted, they were left with the daunting challenge of trying to piece together a movie that was missing both its beginning and its end. Now, Sixel, who went on to win an Oscar for Best Editing for her work on Fury Road, spent a whole year piecing together the movie from the 480 hours worth of footage, all of which was essentially just the middle part of the story. During this time, Jeff Robinov left Warner Brothers and was replaced by Kevin Tsujihara. Later, the odds turned in the franchise's favor as Tsujihara reversed Robinov's decision, allowing George Miller and his team to have one more month of shooting in 2013 to capture the essential scenes and complete the film. The main reason behind the recasting of Furiosa. In general, Miller never had any particular issue with using digital effects unless it screwed with his vision of storytelling, and that's exactly why he chose to recast the original title holder of Furiosa, Charlize Theron. She was one of the major reasons behind the brilliance of Fury Road, and was also set to reprise her role in the prequel film until of course production was delayed. On one hand, the switch makes sense since Furiosa is set about 2 decades before the events of Fury Road, which was released 9 years ago in 2015. While Charlize Theron is an outstanding outstanding actor, it'd be a stretch for her to convincingly play a teenager or someone in their early 20s at this point. Sure, there's always the digital de-aging technology, but that's not really up to Miller's style. Although Miller had originally planned to have Theron reprise her role as Furiosa, he had to reconsider his decision after seeing examples of de-aging technology in other famous films like The Irishman and Gemini Man. He realized how the focus went more on the technological aspects of the film rather than the sheer raw performance of the actors. This decision was rather disappointing for a lot of people, especially considering Theron's enthusiasm for the Furiosa project. She'd been excited about it for years and even expressed her eagerness to prioritize it over other projects. However, all the challenges posed by de-aging technology led to the obvious change in plans. Miller blames all the delays in making Furiosa on the changes within Warner Brothers, the studio producing the film. He originally planned to start Furiosa right after Fury Road premiered in 2015. However, due to several changes in leadership within Warner Brothers, it took nearly a decade before Furiosa could finally move forward. While it's disappointing that Charlize Theron couldn't reprise her role as Furiosa, it's surely not unprecedented in this franchise because even Tom Hardy took over as Max Rokitansky from Mel Gibson, the OG Max in the earlier films.
Ladies and gentlemen, start your engines!
Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, was almost an anime. While we all loved Mad Max, Fury Road, and now Furiosa for their intense action scenes and unique vehicles, Furiosa was almost developed very differently. Originally, it was going to be an anime, but the pre-production for Mad Max Fury Road officially started in 2000 and went through many changes over the next 15 years. In 2010, George Miller revealed his plans to shoot both Mad Max Fury Road and Mad Max Furiosa back-to-back. During the writing process for Fury Road, they even created detailed separate backstories for the characters, especially Furiosa. Miller had confirmed that the script for Furiosa was ready even before they started shooting Fury Road, but the project wasn't what it is now. Apparently, Miller and co-writer Nicola Thuris had initially planned for Furiosa to be an animated prequel. They gave the finished script to Japanese director Mahiro Maeda to turn it into an anime. At that time, the project was titled The Peach. The final product was very similar to the original idea they'd intended for an extended anime movie. As you know, Mad Max Fury Road had a long pre-production process, and Furiosa faced many challenges to get past its development phase. In 2015, Miller shared that they were planning to make the Furiosa anime, but it was again delayed for a second time due to the unexpected heavy rains in Australia, which also delayed the production for Fury Road. So Miller decided there was no point in making the Furiosa anime at that time and chose to focus on making Fury Road instead. Luckily, Furiosa wasn't abandoned entirely. Instead, it was reworked into a live-action format rather than an animated one. So much of what's seen in the final cut of Furiosa actually came from the anime project. The last scene between Dementus and Furiosa, for example, was used for auditioning actors for Fury Road. According to Miller, about 80% of Furiosa was in the original anime version, but it gradually went through some changes to adapt itself for a live-action movie. Furiosa still faced numerous hurdles during pre-production. Besides the delays caused by heavy rains, Miller's production company filed a lawsuit against Warner Brothers in 2017 over unpaid salaries, which further delayed the project. These legal disputes were later resolved in 2020, allowing Furiosa to officially go into production. Had Furiosa proceeded as an anime, its pre-production and production times might have been shorter, and it could have been released sooner than the final product. Apart from that, even the live-action Furiosa faced the challenge of casting a younger version of the titular character. With Miller choosing this route instead of digitally de-aging Charlize Theron, an anime version could have sidestepped this particular issue by having Theron voice her character. Not just that, I think an anime would have also provided Miller and his team with more creative freedom for the chase scenes, vehicles, and more. However, it was much more impressive to see how Miller brought all of that to life in the film. Ultimately, making Furiosa a live-action movie was the better choice, as it brought more cohesion to the Fury Road branch of the Mad Max saga. Same sand, different fury. The same filming location for Furiosa and other movies. So far, George Miller had directed 4 films in the Mad Max universe before Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. With this experience, he's become quite familiar with the best filming locations in Australia. One of the filming locations for Furiosa was just outside Sydney, and it was actually the same spot used for Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome with Tina Turner 40 years ago. But you didn't know that one, did you? The main gossip behind feud between Tom Hardy and Charlize Theron on the sets of Fury Road. So, while filming Fury Road, Theron was famous for her meticulous preparation on set, always arriving sharp on time and approaching her work with discipline. On the other hand, Hardy had a more unconventional approach, as he mostly showed up late by several hours. Even Nicholas Hoult, the actor who played Warboy Nux, mentioned how the dynamic between Theron and Hardy felt like being on a summer holiday where the adults in the front of the car are having arguments. Apparently, on a particular day, Hardy was reportedly 3 hours late for an 8 a.m. call shoot, which was what became the root cause of their beef. Given Theron was right on time, she decided to stay put in the war rig until Hardy arrived and was obviously frustrated with Hardy being late. So, when he ultimately arrived, Theron simply lost it and was inherently vocal about her feelings using pretty decorative phrases, which gradually incited the heated argument between them. Apparently, Hardy's response during this entire fiasco was quite aggressive, which made Theron feel threatened to a point that she requested for protection, and immediately a female producer was flown in to address the matter. The entire situation was quite fraught and frantic, plus the studio couldn't fully grasp on what was happening either. In general, the overall atmosphere on set was quite intense, with the production already facing other challenges in the hot Namibian desert. Despite whatever happened, Theron and Hardy's relationship improved by the end of the film's production, and Hardy even gifted her a self-portrait as a wrap-up present. Honestly, I can't blame them. The desert heat might have really gotten to both their heads. So with that, we come to the very end of the video. Not gonna lie, this franchise will always be very dear to my heart, simply because of how rich the world building and the process of making each Mad Max film is. With that being said, did I miss out on any insider news that you guys know about? Let me know in the comments box below. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.